So today, Dr. Anaïs Augé will talk about skeptical arguments about the climate crisis, and more specifically to the relation between different social-cultural approaches to religions and the skeptical arguments that are developed. So Dr. Anaïs Augé is a FNRS Research Fellow and Associate Lecturer at the University of Louvain in both the Institute of Political Science, Louvain Europe, and the Institute of Language and Communication. And she's the author of a book entitled Metaphor and Argumentation in Climate Crisis Discourse. And she wrote many articles in international journals and edited volumes about those topics. Her fields of research include political discourse analysis, psycholinguistics, and pragmatics, and she is interested in the public understanding of political discourse in intercultural context and politicians' activist argumentation in the context of the climate crisis. So the presentation will be about 30 minutes long, and it will be followed by a discussion. So there is a place where you can react and ask questions. That's the Q&R place in Teams. So you can write your questions, and I will use them to feed the discussion after the presentation. So, Anaïs, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I'll try to share the screen. Normally it should work. And it's yeah, okay. Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really looking forward to the discussions and to gather your thoughts about this topic. So for this presentation today, I wanted to talk about specifically skeptical argumentation in the context of the climate crisis. And as has been just mentioned, I will adopt an intercultural perspective on skepticism. So, okay. So I wanted to start with a bit of background regarding why I'm interested, specifically in the climate crisis. So I was born and I grew up in France, in Normandy, which is famous for the beaches, as you can see in this picture, right? So, you know, like the Norman beaches, there are really beautiful landscapes. A lot of people come from far away to see the beaches and the history behind it. And actually, as I grew up there, it was really just a 10 minutes walk to go there from my house. I realized that these landscapes became increasingly polluted over time. And so growing up there, I thought, well, how can people see the damage that they're doing by, for instance, throwing away plastic bags or cans or foods on these beautiful landscapes, on nature? And so when I started doing research, well, I first started by studying arts. I studied arts for 7 years. And then I thought, well, it's, you know, interesting, it's really relevant. But then in the context of pollution, in the context of the climate crisis, what has an impact is actually politics and political discourse and what is said and done about the climate crisis. So I started to study language. I studied English and other languages to understand how people understood different arguments, different political arguments about the climate crisis. And this is basically the starting point of my book, Metaphor and Argumentation in Climate Crisis Discourse. Another important point before I start is that because of my background in arts and in linguistics, I do think that in order to study these topics, so climate crisis and skepticism and argumentation, we need actually to use different disciplines. So far, in terms of climate crisis discourse, there are two major approaches to this form of discourse, which is ecolinguistics, which is focused on how to explain the climate crisis to the public, and psycholinguistics, which analyzes how people understand climate crisis discourse under different circumstances. So these are two very relevant approaches. But then again, I thought, well, what about the argumentation? What about skepticism? What about activism and persuasion? Sorry. So in my research, I conceive climate crisis discourse as a form of political discourse, climate crisis as a political issue. And I also pay attention to the role of images and narrative in this political discourse. So oops, I'm just going to, sorry, up. So yeah, in order to, so I focused on images and narratives, which, as a lot of study demonstrated, can be used to explain the crisis. They can generate a particular understanding of the climate crisis. And so here I give you just a first example, a very common example, which you probably heard of before. So the forests are the lungs of the planet. So here the images or narratives is related to the body. So the forest is depicted as the lungs and the planet is the body. So this sentence is quite famous and quite popular in climate crisis discourse because it does reflect the public's experiential knowledge. Because by depicting the forest as the lungs of the planet, the public can refer to their own bodily experience. So they can reflect on how they feel when their lungs are infected, for instance. And so it does suggest solutions, like, for instance, what is the cure, who are the doctors, and what is the virus? Okay, so my presentation today will focus on these narratives and images, which in the literature are called metaphors. So I will first start by defining what is a metaphor. I will explain the methodology. I will present my results, and I will end, if I have time, with some further perspectives. So to begin with, what is a metaphor? So a metaphor is a mapping of two different concepts. So I take here again this example of the forest are the lungs of the planet. So in this sentence, you can see that the lungs, so it does relate to the body as previously stated. And you can see that it's not really related to the context. The context of the sentence is related to the climate crisis, and it's not related to the body. So the lungs here is conceived as an alien concept. It's the source concept, according to the literature. The second concept refers to the forest, which is this time completely related to the topic of discussion. It's the literal concept. And in the existing literature, this is called the target concept. So the source concept is the figurative part, and the target concept is the main topic of discourse. So why is it important and interesting? Well, because a lot of studies actually demonstrated that these images, these metaphors, have several functions in discourse. So they do perform educative functions. If you consider, for instance, the prevalence of the phrase greenhouse effect or carbon footprints, which are often used in climate crisis discourse. They also fulfill psycholinguistic functions. So, for instance, there are a number of studies that show, for instance, that the metaphor of the climate war leads to a better understanding than the metaphor of the climate race. But then again, these studies, they are interesting, they are a very relevant starting point, but in the context of poetical discourse and journalistic discourse, a metaphor can actually be exploited to fit different views. So for instance, when you talk about the lungs of the planet, the arguments are very different if you refer to the healthy lungs of the planet or the damaged lungs of the planet. The arguments differ if you talk about a climate defeat or a climate victory. And this point is actually, very important to consider in the context of the climate crisis, because metaphor scholars have long demonstrated that metaphors are very persuasive when they are exploited to convey different arguments. This is called the discourse history of the metaphor. And a very popular example of this persuasive function has been discussed by Andreas Missolf in 2010, who studied the metaphor of the Holocaust, which led to the Second World War, etc., etc. And so, considering all these existing works, I wondered about what happened in climate crisis discourse. What was the discourse history of climate-related arguments? And so I refer mainly to one very relevant article that has been authored by Brigitte Narlich in 2010, where she analyzed the media responses to what is called the ClimateGate scandal, which happened in 2009 in the UK. So the ClimateGate scandal, very briefly, it's a scandal that happened in the University of East Anglia, where climate scientists had been hacked, and their emails have been released to the public. And so, of course, all these emails, they contained a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty that has been understood as a form of, unscientific discussion according to the media. And so all this is discussed by Brigitte Narlich, and she demonstrated that the skeptical viewpoints adopted by journalists in the context of this scandal were religion metaphor. So I give here two examples. Climate change lobby of cultists, global warming believers. And so I take this article as the main starting point of this research, because when I read this article, I thought, well, yes, religion is very important in the United Kingdom, but what about other countries? So for instance, in France and in Belgium, the place of religion is different. And in the UK and the US, the place of religion is also different. So how does the religion metaphor fulfill skeptical arguments in these different countries. And of course, what happens before the climate gets candle and after the climate gets candle. So regarding the methodology, I used 2 different timelines. So the timelines for the English part of my corpus starts in 1980s and end in 2024. This is because I actually did my PhD on the English part of this corpus. And then after my PhD, I completed this corpus with a French corpus, which this time starts in 2006 and ends in 2024. So 2006, just for information, is the start of the first main wave of climate skepticism in the world. So I use different platforms to retrieve texts. So I used Nexus and Europress for collecting the media discourse. And I used poetical speeches by so American, English, Belgian, and French leaders, which dealt with the climate crisis. Then, in order to focus on skeptical discourse, I used keywords to collect the data. And these keywords are either previously identified by scholar or then after reading a sample of text, I also added some keywords that I found in the text that I already analyzed, right? So this gave me a total of over 2,000 texts in my corpus, in which I identified 391 occurrences. So this is just to give you a brief overview of the keywords that I used. So as I mentioned, some of them are linked to the climate crisis and others are linked to religion. In French and English, obviously. Then when I collected these keywords, I applied the method of critical metaphor analysis. So it has 3 different steps. The first step is the identification. So is this a metaphor? So in this step, I analyzed the conceptual and contextual links between religion and the climate crisis. The second step is interpretation, that is, if and how the religion allowed for a skeptical conceptualization of the climate crisis. And the last step is the explanation, in which I used Van Poppel argumentation theory, which identifies the different parties, the different standpoints, the different opinions, and the starting point and outcome of discussion. Yeah, and I wanted also to take this opportunity to thank my colleague Colin Rondia from UC Louvain and Antwerpen, who helped me a lot actually to analyze the French part of the corpus. Okay, so I will start with the example of skeptical discourse in the US. So these are 3 examples from my corpus from 3 different periods, as you can see. So the first one is from the 90s. It's from Fox News. So this is a tough go for people who don't believe in climate change. Then in 2009, the science on climate change is settled, an assertion made by green fanatic Al Gore, who likes to portray skeptics as deniers and flat earthers. While lecturing the public about the need to protect the environment, the high priest of the green cult thinks nothing of swanning around in limousines and jets. This is from the Weekly Standard. And in 2020, this is a quote of a speech by Donald Trump. But to embrace the possibilities of tomorrow, we must reject the perennial prophets of doom and the predictions of the apocalypse that are the heirs of yesterday's foolish fortune tellers. So I will go through these examples one after the other chronologically. So in the 90s, what I observed in my corpus is that the journalists and politicians, they tend to use very typical conventional skeptical metaphors. So the climate crisis is something that you believe in or that you don't believe in. But there is no real strong explicit criticism towards scientists, politicians, and activists. So this kind of moderate skepticism, so to speak, in the 90s may be related to the limited number of studies being mentioned in the media and in politics, or maybe even limited public interest. Now, in the example from 2009, well, 2009 in the US marks a peak of religion metaphor in climate crisis discourse. And this can be related to Al Gore. So Al Gore is a green US politician. And in 2009, he released his own film, a documentary about the climate crisis, which is called The Inconvenient Truth. And he also took part in the government, and because at the time there was a coalition with George Bush government, and Al Gore as the vice president. So all this prevalence of green politics led skeptical community to they legitimized science. So the climate here becomes a false or even a dangerous religion. Here we can see that the religion metaphor are not just typical religion metaphor. They really refer to like an illegal form of religion. Like they talk about fanatic, about a cult. So they really insist on the dangerous part of well, climate crisis and climate crisis science, right? So this use of religion metaphor is aimed at raising public concern. The climate becomes something to control. The climate science becomes something to control, and the influence of science on politics needs to be limited. But we can see here that there is no really further arguments regarding why climate science is so dangerous, according to these skeptical communities. Now in 2020, well, this was Donald Trump's first term as a president. And again, this marks a strong peak of skepticism in the media, notably because of the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, which in turn allowed journalists and politicians to make highly skeptical claims about the climate crisis. So we can clearly see that skepticism is spreading in the US media. So for instance, I took these specific quotes by Donald Trump, which refers to the prophets of doom. And I found that no less than 412 articles actually directly referred to these specific quotes by Donald Trump. Just during the time of the World Economic Forum, which is where Donald Trump made his speech about the prophets of doom. So accordingly, according to Donald Trump, climate is here again a dangerous form of religion. He aims to show that scientists, activists, politicians have interest in climate-related decisions. They are identified as fortune tellers. And this notion of interest by scientists, politicians, and activists may also be linked with the spread and identification of greenwashing in the 2020s. Sorry. What we can see also in the US part of the corpus is that unlike the other parts of the corpus, in the US, skeptical discourse and skeptical metaphor are directly addressed to specific politicians and specific activists. Okay, so now we'll turn to skepticism in the UK. Again, 3 different periods and 3 different examples. The first one comes from a speech by Margaret Thatcher, so the former Prime Minister. She was a conservative. We are far too sensible to think that in 1988 we can turn the clock back to a pre-industrial world where Adam delved and Eve span. The Garden of Eden had a population of 2. Our world has a population of 5 million, going on 6. Then in 2010, this is an extract from the Telegraph. This is a time of year when our thoughts naturally turn to those less fortunate than ourselves. We think of the mentally ill and the tragically deluded. We think of those whose mane don't wash for months, for fear of polluting Mother Gaia's precious clear life blood with soap suds. We think of people who can't eat meat because their strange backwards religions confines them to organic tofu roast. And that's why I urge you to donate to the campaign against climate change, honorary patron George Monbiot. And then in 2016, same trend, end of the world, God, not climate change, will cause apocalypse, from The Express. Okay, so starting with the example from the 80s, this is a very important example because it shows how different crises can overlap in climate crisis discourse. So for instance, in the UK in the 80s, there was a major industrial setback and major protests. And actually, in this example, Margaret Thatcher makes a direct reference to these protests with the quote, Adam dealt and Eve span, because that was a kind of slogan in the 80s in the UK during protests. Then here we can see that she depicts religion as a kind of outdated form of society, a form of life. She refers to the population of 2, which she contrasts with the population in the 80s, which is over several billion, sorry. So this kind of contrast between religion and modern society may be explained by Thatcher's interests as a politician, because it's important to note that even though she was a conservative politician, Margaret Thatcher actually used to be a chemist. She has a degree in chemistry. And so we can see that so science is important to her, despite the fact that she's making skeptical claims about the climate crisis. And we can see this skepticism in terms of the religion metaphor, because accordingly, climate decisions are associated with this outdated form of society, or that outdated form of life. Because she, for instance, refers to the absence of industry, the absence of economy, etc., etc. And here, interestingly, we can see that the prevalent socioeconomic concerns in the 80s downplayed the emergency of the climate crisis. Now, concerning the example from 2010, well, again, this is a year where a lot of skeptical claims have been, well, produced in the media and in politics. This was due to the start of the Kyoto Protocol in 2008 and the Climategate scandal in the UK in 2009. So because of this, skepticism is spreading in the UK media. And for instance, the Telegraph which is a very conservative newspaper, made a lot of highly sarcastic description of climate science and climate activism. So here, for instance, he referred to activists as mentally ill and deluded. Here, climate science and climate crisis is described as a kind of ancient form of religion, a religion that does not prevail in modern society. So, for instance, he refers to Gaia, Mother Gaia, who was the Greek goddess, the goddess of the earth. So it does refer to Greek mythology, not an actual form of modern religion. And this spread of skepticism, this strong sarcastic stance in this article may also be related to the emerging figures and campaign which had a lot of public attention at this period. So here in this example, the journalist refers to George Monbiot, who is a journalist for The Guardian, so a more like left-wing newspaper in the UK, and he's also a climate activist, right? So this emergence of figure activists leads skeptical communities to fear the creation of climate decision, the enforcement of climate decision. And so their strategy is to ridicule climate science in order to prevent political power. Now, more recently, in 2016, we can see that the stance is more or less the same. Again, there is a peak of skepticism, mainly caused by the impact of the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. It's also caused, obviously, by Brexit discussions. So this all led to another wave of climate skepticism in the UK. Okay, I will now turn to skepticism in Belgium. So this time with two different time periods. The first one starts in 2006, and this is an example from the newspaper Le Soir. So ecology has become a religion, and those who doubt its dogma are suspected of witchcraft. Within the environmental sphere, they are informed and nuanced people, but also more radical people with whom it is difficult to initiate a dialogue. Another example from 2024. Florian has had enough of this finger of accusation pointed at him whenever he forgets to sort the waste. This is called eco-shaming, which consists in denouncing one's bad environmental behavior. This may be performed by individuals or activist movements, or even some political groups. This revolves around an accounting system, much like the way the Catholic Church used to keep count of believers' efforts. And this is an extract from the newspaper Le Vif. So regarding the first example from 2006, well, the case of Belgium is very interesting because we can see here that the journalist describes different degrees of beliefs in the climate crisis. So he distinguishes between the people who have an informed view on the climate crisis and the people who just believe in a dogma. So this distinction may be caused by the popularization of the topic, specifically in the media, which led skeptical communities to draw this distinction between science, informed view, and just people who read the media and who are not really interested in reading scientific findings. So here the climate crisis is presented as a scientific topic that should, according to the journalists, remain within the realm of science. And this view is opposed to the depiction of climate as a religion, whereby the public acts according to what they are told without scientific information. So we can see here that there is a more limited degree of skepticism because the journalist still refers to science and climate science as the truth. And in 2024, well, interestingly, this is a very similar trend. There is a very limited degree of skepticism, different degrees of beliefs in climate change. But here, this example specifically blames public behavior. So, for instance, the journalist refers to the Catholic Church accounting system, which here refers to past religious practices when renouncement could be perceived as an instance of heresy, and it was institutionalized and part of the way society worked. And so here the journalist really argues that if climate science take control of society, then similar practices may be enforced. So for instance, he refers to the denouncement of individual. But here again, the journalist opposes two views related to the climate crisis. The first view refers to ecological practices, and the other view refers to ecological ideologies. So to conclude about this example, here the journalist promotes the business as usual scenario. So overall, the argument is still against policies that would impact individual, green policies that would impact individual, even though these policies may not be really significant. So because this example is mainly about sorting one's waste. So overall, this article argues against, well, even the most basic green policy in Belgium. And of course, these policies are referred to as a form of radical environmentalism. Okay, so I will finish this presentation of example with a French example, so from France. And so I start with an example from 2007. These ayatollahs opposed to car circulation do not know what arguments to find to prevent motorists from driving. The fanatics of the Grenelle de l'Environnement designated the car as their scapegoat. And this is from the newspaper Valeurs Actuelles. Then, of course, I had to quote this quite famous example. So it's a quote from the far-right politician Eric Zemmour from 2020, who said, coincidentally, the green color of the Green Party matches the green color of the Islamic symbol. And then in 2022, so this is a quote by Laurent Nunez, who is the French prefect. So many individuals develop a form of violence radicalness regarding environmentalism and present a huge risk of violence. A lot of them are considered to be serious threats to national security in the same way Islamist terrorists are. We need to be careful. So to start with the first example from Valeurs Actuelles in 2007, what is important to note is that religion as a topic in political discourse, in public discourse in general, is considered a taboo in France. This has been claimed by many scholars. This is related to French history, which I will not go through now, but it's important to keep in mind that this taboo may explain the fact that in France, in French discourse, the religion metaphor may not be typical religion metaphor. They may not refer to the Catholic religion or the Christian religion, for instance. Instead, they will use Islamic metaphor. So we have seen climate activists and politicians described as ayatollahs, for instance, because this is all associated with far-right discourse and anti-immigration discourse. So for instance, here this example comes from an article published in 2007, and it's important to note that this was a period where the far right was very powerful. So we can note, for instance, the first time that, the highest score reached, the first higher score reached by a far-right politician was in 2002 in France. And then 2007 represented the next electoral election. And so this explains why the journalist here uses a metaphor related to Islam in order to talk about the climate crisis. And of course, there is also the Kyoto Protocol, which also led to a wave of skepticism in France. So here, as I mentioned, we can notice an overlap between anti-immigration discourse and climate skepticism, which is still confined to far-right discourse. Here, what's important to note is that through the mention of Ayatollah, the journalist warns about non-democratic regimes. So because the Ayatollah, for instance, represent a figure of authority who are in power in non-democratic countries like Iran, for instance. And so the argument implies that a climate-related power would be identical to these non-democratic regimes. Now we'll present altogether the examples from 2020 and 2022, because both show that this skepticism has spread across the political sphere. So in 2020, this was found in discourse by a far-right politician, and in 2022 in the discourse of the French prefect. And we can see how skeptical metaphor transformed into conspiracy theory and skeptical decision making. So for instance, this representation of activists and climate politics in terms of Islamic metaphors according to the far-right perspective, right, led notably to the dissolution of the French climate movement called Les Soulèvements de la Terre in 2023, because, these activists were represented as eco-terrorists. And we can see here clearly the link between these Islamic metaphor in far-right discourse and the supposed threats of eco-terrorism. So here we can see that the skepticism transformed into conspiracies, which both applied to the Islamic religion and to the climate crisis. So if we reconstruct the metaphor, environmentalism is represented as Islam, climate activists are represented as believers of Islam, and believers of Islam, according to, again, the far-right perspective, right, it's not mine, but believers of Islam are represented as Islamists, and so activists are also represented as Islamists, and so they represent a threat to national security. Now, if I have time, I wanted to end this presentation with some first perspective regarding how to promote a counter perspective regarding these skeptical stances and these conspiracy theories. And I did some research, I started to do some research regarding the counter-arguments in the context of the dissolution of the climate movements in France and the threat of eco-terrorism. So I found three main strategies, and this is the first one. So yeah, I will first quote this example from the media reporter. Sorry. So I quote, by calling protesters eco-terrorists, Gérald Darmanin favors communication over any form of reality. He presents activists as criminal in order to minimize environmental crimes. So here, this first strategy is to use the same arguments, but to transform the topic, the actors within the arguments. So according to politicians, activists are criminals, but in this example, the political inaction is here described as being criminal. So the journalists here transform the target concept of the metaphor to shed light on the identity of the actual terrorists. Okay, a second strategy with a second example from the newspaper Le Monde. So protesters fear that the term eco-terrorism is used to justify a war against environmentalists. They remember how the government prevented them from protesting by commissioning an army of more than 1,500 police officers. So here the strategy is actually to transform the source concept of the metaphor. That is, instead of talking about terrorism, the journalist here talks about a war. And this comes with a lot of significant arguments because unlike terrorism, a war is a conflict that has been decided by the government. And it also has a lot of implication in terms of the victim, in terms of the risk, because the victims of eco-terrorism might be police officers, they might be industries, but the victim of the war are actually, well, the public citizens at large. And a final example, which is maybe my favorite example. So this comes from the climate movement Extinction Rebellion, so the French group of the climate movement. What's interesting here is that they really reused and endorsed the political skeptical claim about activists being criminal and terrorists. And so they use images to show the absurdity of these political claims. So they represent environmentalism as a crime, activists as criminals and terrorists, but then again, they highlight the missing part of the political narrative, which is, well, activists do not really have weapons. So here, by shading light on this, they represent terrorist weapons as carrots, with a lot of sarcasm, obviously, which is implicitly opposed to the harming consequences of pollutions by industries. So to briefly conclude this presentation, I wanted to highlight a few strategies regarding the counter arguments when you come across skeptical argumentation about the climate crisis. So one strategy is to highlight the missing elements of the skeptical narratives. For instance, you can focus on what is exactly the crime, who are the victim, and who is in power, who has decided of the conflict. A second strategy is to highlight the identity, the expertise, and the responsibility of the discourse producer. That is the discourse producer a journalist, a politician, or is it a scientist who has made a lot of studies and experiments to argue about his viewpoint on the climate crisis? Then a last strategy to resist skeptical argumentation is to highlight the absurdity of the skeptical narrative by exploiting images to describe all the aspects of the climate crisis, from the cause to the consequences, to the risk and the victims, etc., etc. And of course, to rely on different modes of communication, because a lot of studies actually demonstrated that different parts of the publics will have different sensibilities regarding different modes. For instance, someone who reads a text may not immediately grasp the arguments in a text, but they will find it more easy easier to grasp the arguments if it's presented in a video or in an image. So these are my references, and thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for this presentation. That was really, really interesting. And I wanted to ask you a question about what do we do now? And I think you already gave some answer. That's really interesting. Everyone, you can react or add questions in the Q&A part of Teams, so don't hesitate. There is a comment from Trisha about, I will just read it. I find it fascinating that we notice how, especially for Belgium and France, cultural sensibilities are present. Some Belgians are very negative vis-à-vis the Catholic Church. For France, there is linking of Islamophobic and anti-climate discourses. What I find interesting too, with the difference between the different countries, and that don't seem that different in terms, of sharing on some values, etc., etc. It's also the way that kind of discourse can be brought in some clear conservative waves. The Trump moment, the Brexit moment, and the current moment in France, and the difference between those countries and Belgium, where there is quite of, maybe the French-speaking Belgian part, because I guess there are differences too, but there is like some kind of soft conservative view, kind of naturalization of social practices, and the journalist adapts of the way it's supposed to be and don't ask questions about it. So I think that's really interesting. And I wanted to ask you something about, again, where do we go from there, but not about how we can react to metaphor or we invest meaning in metaphors, because you just showed us how to do it, but more about for those Cassandre, those climate activists, to create maybe efficient metaphors, so solid metaphors that cannot be turned against them or used sarcastically, and how can it be efficient at local and international level? You talked about diversity of modes and perspectives, but are there any other ways of doing it?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Well, about the first question, I'd say it's still important for activists to use a metaphor that will be disputed by skeptical communities, because this is how the metaphor actually lives through in climate crisis discourse. Then again, yeah, I don't think it's really possible to find a metaphor that will not be disputed. Yeah, I don't think so, but it's actually a link with your second question. What works, I think, because I've studied international discourse, and, well, discourse at International Climate Summit, for instance. And what works well is when you use personal narrative. That may or may not be linked with the climate crisis. So, for instance, if you talk about, I don't know, a fairy tale, a story, and then you link it with the climate crisis, then you have the story that is already established. You already have the beginning, the end, the actors within the story. So it's really hard actually to find counter arguments. And what works as well, especially in international discourse, is to refer to your own experience of the climate crisis, because in international meetings, you have a lot of people from the global south, who have their own experience of the climate crisis. And so people like Donald Trump, like Eric Zemmour, like Boris Johnson, they cannot really find arguments against them because they really don't have the same experience.
Okay, thank you for this answer. That's really interesting. There are several comments and questions in the Q&R part. I will see some of them. So Martin is talking about the fact that maybe a politician, when they have discourses, they often use way of winning the discussion with a lot of metaphors and exaggeration. So, for example, to make your opponent unpopular. So, is there any differences here in that situation, or it's just quite the game, the political game of this kind of figure, especially the populist or conservative figures?
I would say well, first, thank you for this interesting question. I'd say actually it used to be different when climate change as a topic was not really the main political topic. But now in recent years, like even Donald Trump and all these right-wing politicians, they need to talk about the climate crisis, and they cannot really say they are deniers or skeptical, or so instead they would adopt specific strategies to use metaphor that will look as if they know what they are talking about, as if they have read scientific papers about the climate crisis, even though when you really analyze the discourse as such, you see that the argument is completely skeptical, but it's more implicit.
And I have a question from Geoffroy Patriarche about the fact that there is this use of the religious framing, and the question of is it possible maybe to use this religious framing to as a strategy of resistance, or do you think it's not possible?
Yeah, thank you. It's actually very. I think the religion metaphor is actually quite difficult to dispute because, so for instance, with the case of Donald Trump and his use of religion metaphor, in the example that I showed you, it was during a debate opposing him and Greta Thunberg. And so it was really interesting, this debate, because Greta Thunberg actually kept reusing Donald Trump's metaphor, except for the religion metaphor. She never found any, counter use of the religion metaphor. And I think this is linked with the first question that you asked, because I think that the religion metaphor is also linked with a kind of story of narrative. So once the story is associated with a specific argument, it's actually difficult to find a counter argument using the same metaphor. But you can still use a different form of religion, for instance.
Thank you, and I think that you analyze it deeply in your book, that example. So I recommend everyone here to read it. It's really interesting. So I will finish with the comment of Trisha, who says that's an helpful addition on resistance strategies, and that it resonates with EDMO BELUX research that we conducted on susceptibility to disinformation, intensive social media users, mostly youth, age, media practice, seniors, age, media practice, highly skeptical citizens, political, ideological motivation, and the response for each must differ as the reason for believing disinformation differs. So I find it really interesting. That brings us to the end of today's lunch lecture. Thank you again, Dr. Anaïs Augé, to this presentation and this discussion. Thank you for all of you for being part of the discussion. And we look forward to seeing you at our next session somewhere in June. And have a nice week. Bye.